A Christmas murder in London, a killer fleeing across the sea, and a brutal crime aboard a ship bound for Australia. This isn't just a tale of blood, it's a story that slipped through the cracks of time. Let's dive into one of the most chilling connections in Victorian crime history, London Christmas Day, 1872. While families across the grand city of London gathered to enjoy Christmas with food and laughter, something dark was happening elsewhere. In a small boarding house on Great Coram Street, a terrible discovery was about to unfold. It was a moment that would shock all of Victorian society and leave behind a mystery that has never been solved. Chapter 1. A shocking Christmas morning. The clock had just struck 12 noon when Mrs. Harriet Wright, the landlady of 12 Great Coram Street in Bloomsbury, walked toward her tenant's room, feeling increasingly uneasy. Miss Harriet Buswell, a dancer from the Alhambra Theatre, hadn't been seen since returning late on Christmas Eve. She had come home with a male companion, but now it was Christmas Day, and no one had heard from her. Worried Mrs. Wright knocked on the door several times. "Miss Buswell, Miss Buswell, are you all right? Please answer," she called. But there was no reply. Her concern turned into dread. She got help to break open the door, which was strangely locked from the outside. The key was missing. As the door burst open, what they saw inside would never leave them. "God save us, murder. There's been a murder in my house," Mrs. Wright screamed. There on the bed, soaked in blood, lay the body of Harriet Buswell. Her throat had been cut so deeply that the knife had reached the bone. A bloody handprint marked her forehead, proof that someone had held her down as they killed her. Instead of joy, Christmas Day had brought horror and violence to number 12 Great Coram Street. Chapter 2. The Life Behind the Curtain. But who was Harriet Buswell, the victim of this awful tragedy? She was born around 1845 in the town of Wisbech, Cambridgeshire. Like many young women of her time, she moved to London with dreams of a better life. By her late 20s, she had become a ballet dancer at the glamorous Alhambra Theatre in Leicester Square. On stage, she was known as Clara Burton, or Clara Bruton. But behind the bright lights of the theater, her life was anything but easy. Money was always a struggle. Just the night before she was murdered, Harriet had borrowed a shilling from another tenant before heading out. She was behind on rent, but hours before her death, she paid Mrs. Wright the 9 shillings she owed using a half-sovereign coin. And Harriet carried another heavy responsibility, one rarely spoken of in polite society. Poor Harriet, one fellow dancer had said, "She works harder than anyone. She has the little one to think of, you see." Indeed, Harriet had an 8-year-old daughter named Kate, born around 1864. Taking care of a child alone added to her financial pressures. Like many stage performers in Victorian London, she sometimes turned to prostitution to make ends meet. It was a sad truth, one that would shape how the public and police treated her murder. Chapter 3. A Society of Double Standards. To understand how Harriet lived and died, we must look at the world she lived in. Victorian London had very strict views on morality, especially for women. Respectable women were expected to stay in the home, raising children and caring for their husbands. The world outside the streets, the businesses, the politics, belonged to men. Any woman who stepped outside these limits, especially those involved in what Victorians called the social evil, faced shame and danger. For women like Harriet, who worked in the theater or lived on the edge of poverty, sex work wasn't about sin. It was about survival. Official reports said there were about 800 to 600 prostitutes in London at the time, but historians now believe the real number was closer to 80,000. Most were working-class women doing whatever they could to get by. These poor women suffered twice, one social reformer wrote. Once from poverty, and again from a society that turns its back on them. Even in death, they are ignored by those meant to protect them. Harriet lived in Bloomsbury, a neighborhood that reflected London's changing social map. Once home to the rich and noble by the 1870s, Bloomsbury had become a place where all kinds of people lived side by side. Great Coram Street, where Harriet lived, was lined with simple boarding houses for clerks, performers, and anyone who could manage the rent. Chapter 4. Christmas Eve, 1872. Harriet Buswell's final day on Earth can be pieced together clearly thanks to many eyewitness accounts. On Christmas Eve around 10 in the morning, she left her room at the 12 Great Coram Street after borrowing a shilling. Her destination was the Alhambra Theater, where she was surrounded by grand chandeliers and luxurious red curtains. It was there that she met a man who would later become the center of a murder investigation, a stranger who spoke with a thick German accent. The man's identity would become the biggest question in the days to follow. That evening, Buswell and the German-speaking man had dinner together at the Cavour restaurant. Their waiter, William Stalker, would later remember serving the pair. Later still, they boarded an omnibus from Piccadilly Circus, heading toward Bloomsbury. On that same ride was a barmaid from the Alhambra, who would soon become a key witness. Before they returned to Buswell's lodgings, the couple made a stop at George Fleck's grocery shop to buy some apples and nuts. Maybe it was meant to be a light snack for the night, or perhaps in a darker possibility, it was part of the man's already set plan for murder. "Yes, I remember them clearly," George Fleck later said. "The lady had come here before. The gentleman was new to me clearly, foreign German by his voice and look. He seemed well-mannered, educated. They seemed happy. Just a cheerful couple, buying fruit and nuts for Christmas." At around midnight, Harriet and the man arrived back at her lodging house. Mrs. Wright, the landlady, was still awake and saw them return. Soon after, Harriet paid her overdue rent of 9 shillings, using a half-sovereign, an odd detail, since it suggested she had cash shortly before being killed, raising doubts that robbery was the killer's true motive. She looked cheerful, not at all worried. The man looked proper, well-dressed. "I had no reason to suspect anything, no reason at all." God help me, Mrs. Wright would later say in court. What happened inside Harriet Buswell's room after that is a mystery lost to time. But early the next morning, at around 6:30 on Christmas Day, someone heard the German man leave the house. By then, Harriet was already dead, killed in a horrific act of violence. Chapter 5. The Scene of Death. Christmas morning usually brings warmth and joy. But the scene that police found in Harriet Buswell's room was horrifying, a sharp contrast to the festive holiday around them. The Times newspaper later described the bed as having a dreadful appearance, soaked in blood. Harriet's throat had been cut so deeply that the blade reached the bone. It was a gruesome killing that reminded many of the Jack the Ripper murders, though those wouldn't happen for another 16 years. The police surgeon noted how brutal the attack was. This was no quick scuffle. The wound shows deep anger, or cold calculation. There's a handprint on her forehead, like someone held her down. Death came quickly, but the moments before must have been terrifying. Among the strange clues in the room was a half-eaten apple. Investigators made a mold of the bite marks, an early attempt at what we now call forensic dentistry. The bite didn't match Harriet's teeth, proving someone else had eaten it. Though the science was too new to help much back then, it was a glimpse into the future of crime solving. Blood-stained towels and handkerchiefs lay around the room. This could mean the killer tried to clean up or wiped himself down before escaping. Even more chilling, the door had been locked from the outside and the key taken. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment killing. It had been carefully planned. Some of Harriet's belongings were missing jewelry and a pawn ticket. This led police to consider robbery, but she had just paid rent with a gold coin, which suggested she still had money shortly before the murder. So if the motive was robbery, it wasn't straightforward. The mystery only deepened. Chapter 6. The Hunt Begins. Superintendent Thompson from the E Division of the Metropolitan Police took charge of the case. Public interest exploded as news of the murder spread. On December 26th, just a day after the body was found, the Times published an article on the crime at Great Coram Street. But this was an era without modern tools, no fingerprints, no DNA testing, not even proper autopsies. The case would have to be solved the old-fashioned way by talking to people and collecting witness statements. We are looking for a man who seems foreign, speaks German, around 30 years old. Well-dressed and polite, said Superintendent Thompson. If you saw this man on Christmas Eve, we need to hear from you. To help the search, a reward of $200 was offered, a huge amount at the time, worth about $22,500 today. The reward encouraged people to come forward, but it also raised doubts later about whether some witnesses were motivated by money rather than truth. Still, the investigation moved quickly. Many people remembered seeing Harriet and the German man. George Fleck, the grocer, remembered selling them apples and nuts. The waiter at the Cavour restaurant remembered serving them dinner. The Alhambra barmaid remembered riding the same omnibus. And Mrs. Wright had seen them arrive back at the house. All of them described the same kind of man, foreign German-speaking, well-dressed, and well-mannered. These clues soon led investigators toward someone no one expected. Chapter 7. The Wangaland Connection. In January 1873, the police investigation led them to a German ship named Wangaland, docked at Ramsgate for repairs. The vessel was preparing to sail to Brazil, carrying both passengers and crew who hoped to start a new German colony there. Among those aboard were two men who would become central to the case: Karl Vobe, the assistant surgeon, and Dr. Gottfried Hessel, the ship's chaplain. As the police boarded the ship, Inspector Harnett of the Metropolitan Police made an official announcement. "I am Inspector Harnett. I must request that all gentlemen of this ship's company present themselves for identification regarding a very serious matter." He had traveled all the way from London, bringing witnesses with him to conduct a formal identification parade, a clear sign of how seriously the authorities were taking the Buswell murder. At first, suspicion fell on Karl Vobe, who was quickly arrested. But during the parade, something completely unexpected happened. Witnesses didn't identify Vobe, but instead pointed directly at Dr. Gottfried Hessel, the ship's chaplain. "That's him, the tall man with the serious look. I'd stake my life on it," one witness whispered with certainty. This shocking identification sent waves through both the German community and British society. The idea that a man of the cloth, a 31-year-old clergyman from Prussia, ordained in 1867, could be involved in such a violent crime deeply unsettled many. Dr. Hessel now stood at the center of a chilling murder investigation. Chapter 8. The Clergyman in the Dock. On January 29, 1873, Dr. Gottfried Hessel appeared at Bow Street Magistrates Court. The prosecution's case relied almost entirely on what the eyewitnesses had claimed to see. Out of 7 witnesses at the identification parade, 5 had confidently said Hessel was the man they saw with Harriet Buswell. George Fleck, a greengrocer, insisted that Hessel was the man who had bought fruit with Harriet. William Stalker, a waiter from the Cavour restaurant was equally firm in stating that Hessel was the man he served supper to alongside the victim. These testimonies clearly place the accused with the victim on the night she was killed, argued the prosecutor. But Hessel had a strong defense. He claimed that on Christmas Eve he had been sick in bed at Kroll's Hotel in America Square, London. Several people backed up this story. Karl Vobe, the same man once suspected, testified that he saw Hessel in the hotel's dining room at 8:30 p.m. and noticed that he looked seriously ill, so ill in fact that he prescribed him medicine. The defense counsel, Mr. Straight, delivered a powerful speech to the courtroom. These witnesses haven't been guided by memory or light, but by the $200 reward. Their identifications are driven not by truth, but by greed. His words struck a nerve. The courtroom erupted into applause, reflecting growing public doubt about whether Hessel was truly guilty. One more piece of evidence came from Jane Summers, a housekeeper at the Royal Hotel in Ramsgate. She claimed that when Hessel returned after Christmas, he had asked for turpentine to clean his clothes and had sent stained handkerchiefs to be laundered, stains she said looked like blood. Even so, the judge found the evidence lacking. Having reviewed all presented material, I find it insufficient to commit the accused for trial. Dr. Gottfried Hessel is discharged without suspicion, ruled Magistrate James Vaughan. And just like that, on January 29th, Hessel was a free man. The case against him collapsed. The Morning Post reported his release 2 days later on January 31st. Public opinion shifted. Sympathy flooded in. A public donation campaign raised $1,225 for Hessel, including $30 from Queen Victoria herself. He even received an apology letter from Prime Minister Gladstone. It seemed the nation had forgiven him. Chapter 9. The mystery deepens. Although Hessel was cleared, one crucial question remained unanswered: who really killed Harriet Buswell? Not long after Hessel's release, an anonymous letter from Germany surfaced. It accused Hessel of having a troubled past, being removed from a church post because of drinking and unpaid debts. This information came too late to impact the trial, but it did cast some doubt on his previously spotless reputation. Meanwhile, the investigation hit a dead end. With no modern forensic science, the police had run out of options. The case went cold. The police commissioner made a public statement. The investigation remains open, though I must admit, our leads are few. We will continue to pursue any real information that might help us bring Harriet Boswell's killer to justice. For nearly 150 years, the brutal murder on Christmas Eve stayed unsolved, a dark, forgotten mystery from Victorian London. But that wasn't the end. In recent years, new research brought forth a fascinating theory, one that would take the story far beyond the streets of London, stretching all the way across the globe. A theory that might finally explain what really happened that cold December night. Chapter 10. The Rifleman Connection. In 2019, researcher Stanley Bruce introduced a chilling theory that connected the murder of Harriet Buswell to a man named Wilhelm Krauss. Krauss, a German national, had signed aboard the British ship Rifleman using the alias William Cross just 2 days after Harriet was killed. This timing immediately raised red flags. On December 25th, 1872, Harriet Buswell was murdered in London. Then on December 28th, 1872, the Rifleman departed London for Sydney, Australia, with Wilhelm Krauss under his new name on board. The short gap between the murder and Krauss's sudden departure made it suspicious, especially since witnesses had mentioned the killer was a German-speaking man. Bruce believed this wasn't just coincidence. He saw the timeline as highly suspicious. But what made Krauss's story even more disturbing was what happened next far from London and out at sea. Chapter 11. Murder at Sea. On March 16, 1873, less than 3 months after Harriet's murder, another act of violence occurred. While the Rifleman was sailing toward Australia, Wilhelm Krauss brutally killed Captain James Reack Longmuir. Before committing this murder, Krauss had tried something even more sinister. He attempted to poison the entire crew by mixing narcotics into the food and grog in the cabin. His plan, as later revealed in court, was to take over the ship. The judge in Sydney called it a cunningly devised plan to obtain possession of the ship. When Krauss was arrested, he was found with weapons and ropes, 7 cords in total, hidden in the pantry. He had a revolver, a dagger, and a long iron bolt, which he used to attack the ship's chief officer. The verdict was clear. Wilhelm Krauss, you have been found guilty of the murder of Captain James Reack Longmuir. You shall be taken from this place to the place from whence you came, and then to a place of execution, and there be hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may God have mercy on your soul, declared the judge. Krauss was hanged on July 1, 1873, at Darlinghurst Jail in Sydney, just over 6 months after Harriet Buswell's murder. If Bruce's theory is correct, then Krauss, the man who killed Harriet, was eventually brought to justice. But it happened not in London and not for her murder, but for a second unrelated killing thousands of miles away. Bruce even suggested that bite marks left on an apple found at the Buswell crime scene could be compared to Krauss's dental records. Since he was buried in Australia, this kind of test might still be possible. Unfortunately, it has never been done. So while the theory remains compelling, it's still unconfirmed. Chapter 12. Echoes in Time. Today, Great Coram Street in Bloomsbury shows no visible sign of the tragic events of Christmas 1872. The world of gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages has been replaced by electric lights and cars. But the shadows of that time and Harriet's story still echo across the years. Her life and death reveal a lot about Victorian society, especially the dangers faced by working-class women. Harriet Buswell lived a life caught between two worlds. She was a performer in the theater and at times a prostitute. Women like her were often treated with indifference by the public and by the police when they became victims. The Buswell case shows how issues like gender class and reputation shaped how crimes were investigated and how the public responded. For example, while many rallied to support Dr. Hessel, a respected doctor who was wrongly accused, few expressed concern for Harriet. If Stanley Bruce is right, and Krauss was indeed her killer, then the story links two murders separated by oceans, but possibly committed by the same man. That this connection took almost 150 years to uncover shows how limited police coordination was across countries in the 19th century. It also reminds us how many mysteries from the past remain unsolved. Harriet Buswell was more than just a victim. She was a mother, a performer, and a woman navigating a difficult world. Her case remains officially unsolved, yet the execution of Krauss may have unknowingly served justice in her name. Her story should be remembered not simply as a shocking crime, but as a reflection of the time and place she lived in. A time when societal judgment and inequality shaped every part of life, even in death. Closing reflection. London Christmas, 1872. While families celebrated the holiday, one woman's life ended in violence. Over 150 years later, her tragic story still haunts us. It's a Victorian mystery that may have found its grim resolution not in a London courtroom, but at the gallows in far-off Sydney. One woman, two continents and justice that may have come far too late. If this story gave you chills, make sure to subscribe for more forgotten crimes and haunting histories from the past.